After months of fierce combat, the Japanese evacuated the strategically vital island of Guadalcanal. Major General Kenryo Sato, head of the War Ministry's Military Affairs Bureau, was likely the first Japanese commander to suggest relinquishing the island to the Americans. Sato advised Prime Minister Hideki Tojo to abandon plans of recapturing Guadalcanal and to stop sending reinforcements. When Tojo asked if this meant a withdrawal, Sato replied that it was probably too late to win the war by continuing on the current path. Convinced by Sato's reasoning, Tojo recognized that Japan had overextended itself in terms of troops and supplies in the battle for Guadalcanal. Yet Emperor Hirohito and senior officers were not ready to concede. On December 5, 1942, at a cabinet meeting, Tojo committed to sending an additional 95,000 tons of supplies to the starving troops, on top of the 290,000 tons already planned. Still, the topic of withdrawal resurfaced. By early December, the Japanese War Ministry and Army General Staff had started discussing pulling out of the island. Just a month earlier, this idea would have been unthinkable. Since August 7, when U.S. forces first invaded Guadalcanal and its critical airstrip, Henderson Field, Japanese troops had fought relentlessly to retake the island. Both sides suffered heavy casualties in men, ships, planes, and resources. The key difference was that Japan could not afford the losses, while the U.S. could. Despite their failed efforts, Japan's general staff insisted on resupplying the troops. The Navy devised a method using floating metal drums partially filled with supplies. These were loaded onto destroyers, dropped near the coast, and dragged ashore by swimmers. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka led this effort. On the night of November 29, 8 destroyers headed toward Guadalcanal. 6 of them carried supply drums. As they neared Tassafaronga Point, American warships, 5 cruisers, and 6 destroyers were spotted. Tanaka ordered a halt to the unloading and prepared for battle. Although radar gave the Americans an edge, Tanaka had the long lance torpedo, which proved decisive. The American cruiser Minneapolis was hit by 2 torpedoes. New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton were also struck, with Northampton sinking. In under 30 minutes, Tanaka's forces damaged or destroyed 4 cruisers while losing just 1 destroyer. Still, the mission failed to deliver supplies. A few nights later, another attempt succeeded in dumping around 1,500 drums, but only 300 reached shore. The rest drifted away. A third attempt was a total failure as American airstrikes and PT boats forced a retreat. By mid-December, Japanese naval leaders saw the futility of the campaign and began preparing for a full withdrawal. The drum method had proven ineffective and wasteful. The army, however, still hoped for a renewed offensive. Some pragmatic commanders began working on a strategy to retreat without it appearing as a defeat. The situation worsened with a telegram from Lieutenant General Harukichi Kakutake, head of the 17th Army on Guadalcanal. On December 23, he reported they were out of food and unable to send out scouts. He requested permission to launch a final raid on enemy trenches rather than die of starvation. Japanese troops even created a grim survival scale. A man who could stand had 30 days to live. If he could only sit, 20. If he urinated lying down, 3. If he couldn't speak, 2. And if he couldn't blink, he'd be dead before dawn. 2 days after Hyakutake's report, senior Army and Navy leaders met at the Imperial Palace. Each side blamed the other. The Army accused the Navy of inadequate support, and the Navy faulted the Army for wasting resources. One officer remarked that deploying troops without proper supplies was like sending someone onto a roof and taking the ladder away. After 4 days, Colonel Joichiro Sanada arrived with a proposal supported by all consulted officers: full withdrawal from Guadalcanal. War simulations confirmed that any attempt to reinforce the island would be crushed by American forces. The combination of Sanada's report, Hyakutake's telegram, and the results of the simulations convinced everyone that retreat was necessary. The goal was now to evacuate all forces by the end of January. Before anything could proceed, Emperor Hirohito had to be informed. A meeting was held on December 31. Disappointed and frustrated, the emperor listened as it was explained that despite months of effort, Japan had failed to remove American forces. He was particularly upset that American construction crews completed airfields in days, while Japanese crews took weeks. He was told this was due to the Americans using machinery, while Japanese crews relied on manual labor, a response that did not satisfy him. For 2 hours, he questioned his military leaders before finally, albeit reluctantly, approving the evacuation. By then, American intelligence had already begun to suspect that Japan was preparing for a major withdrawal rather than another attack. a significant effort to retake Guadalcanal, known as Cactus to the Allies, was still evident. Analysts at the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, CI and CPAC, noted that some form of attack appeared imminent. Admiral Tanaka's continued efforts to reinforce the garrison on the island were viewed as compelling evidence. Moreover, the concentration of Japanese warships and cargo vessels near Rabaul signaled that an operation was underway. By late December, approximately 70 ships were anchored in the harbor. There were other signs as well. On New Year's Day 1943, the Japanese changed their radio codes, making it harder for Allied intelligence to track their plans, at least until the new code was broken again. In addition, a notable surge in Japanese radio traffic confirmed that a major military buildup was in progress. This activity wasn't limited to Rabaul. More ships and aircraft were being deployed to other locations such as Truk and the Shortland Islands. Throughout December and January, Allied intelligence collected and analyzed these developments, concluding that the Japanese were preparing for a new offensive, possibly targeting either the Solomon Islands or New Guinea. A communiqué dated January 26, 1943, warned of a likely Japanese attack soon, under the name Operation K. However, this assessment was incorrect. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had no plans to retake Guadalcanal. Operation K, in fact, referred to the planned evacuation of all Japanese forces from the island in mid-January. Allied analysts had completely misread Tokyo's intentions. Operation K was divided into two main parts. The first phase involved landing an infantry battalion to act as a rear guard, holding off American forces while the rest of the 17th Army withdrew. Supplies for 3 weeks were also to be delivered during this phase. The second phase focused on the evacuation itself, during which destroyers would transport most of the troops off the island, effectively reversing the previous Tokyo Express missions. Soldiers would be moved from shore to destroyers using landing craft, and submarines were prepared to rescue any stragglers. Meanwhile, Japanese forces would create diversions to mislead the Americans, including attacks east of the Marshall Islands and phony radio traffic suggesting action near Port Darwin in Australia. The entire operation was scheduled to be completed by February 10, 1943. In the weeks leading up to the evacuation, the Japanese Navy continued Tokyo Express missions, despite constant interference from American aircraft and patrol boats. On January 3, 5 days' worth of supplies were delivered via rubber bags and drums. On January 14, 9 warships transported the 750-man Yano Battalion to Guadalcanal, along with an artillery detachment under Major Kiji Yano, who would serve as the rear guard. Colonel Hashimoto also landed with the Yano Battalion, tasked with personally delivering the evacuation orders to General Hashimoto. Hashimoto arrived after midnight near Cape Esperance, finding the area strewn with corpses, which led him to the 17th Army's headquarters. After a tense hike through the jungle, Hashimoto reached Hyakute's camp around midnight. The general was stunned by the evacuation order, having expected plans for a counterattack instead. After hearing that the order came directly from the emperor, he reluctantly accepted it. Hashimoto described seeing Hyakutake sitting alone under a large tree, deeply shaken by the news. The general asked for solitude to reflect before finally agreeing to proceed with the evacuation, acknowledging the difficulty of executing the retreat successfully. On January 18, the 17th Army was informed of the operation. The news was met with emotional resistance from officers and soldiers alike, many of whom were unwilling to abandon their sick and wounded comrades. Despite these feelings, senior leaders understood that they had no choice but to follow imperial orders. The 38th Division was to be the first to leave Guadalcanal. However, since January 10, American General Alexander M. Patch had ordered operations to drive the Japanese into the sea, with objectives including Galloping Horse Hill, Seahorse, and Gifu, all located south of Point Cruz. On January 17, Japanese defenders at Gifu launched a desperate suicide attack. Nevertheless, American forces captured Galloping Horse Hill on January 13, Seahorse on January 16, and Gifu on January 18. General Patch then turned to target Cocambona, a key Japanese base. A column of 4 destroyers, Radford, De Haven, Nicholas, and O'Bannon, bombarded Japanese positions near the area on the night of January 19. Meanwhile, engineers extended roads and Army Marine units advanced toward the enemy, supported by artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes. By January 23, American troops pushed into Cocambona, only to find that most of the Japanese had already withdrawn, retreating westward toward Cape Esperance to await evacuation. General Patch, unaware of the retreat, refrained from committing all forces, believing a large Japanese counteroffensive was still likely. The Yano Battalion, serving as the rear guard, fought effectively to delay the Americans. After crossing the Bonity River, they dug in again on January 29 and held out for several more days before continuing their withdrawal. The evacuation began in earnest on January 31, when 21 warships departed from the Shortland Islands. Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto commanded the transport destroyers, who were dubbed the Deceptive Reinforcement Unit, in case American intelligence intercepted their communications. The light cruiser Sendai and heavy cruisers Chokai and Kamano provided support. Float planes protected the destroyers from American aircraft, and if needed, the full 11th Air Fleet was ready to assist. Early on February 1, coast watchers north of Guadalcanal spotted at least 12 Japanese ships approaching via the slot. American aircraft from Henderson Field, known collectively as the Cactus Air Force, launched an aggressive counterattack. 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 7 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and 17 F-4F Wildcat fighters took off to intercept. 4 of the attacking aircraft were shot down, but one bomb landed near Hashimoto's flagship, Mikes. Although the ship wasn't sunk, it was damaged and had to return to base. Hashimoto transferred command to the destroyer Shirayuki and continued the mission. Later that night, 2 American PT boats launched a torpedo attack near Savo Island, followed by 5 more shortly afterward. Thanks to luck and air support, the Japanese avoided serious losses. Around 10:40 p.m., the destroyers reached shore, and boats were lowered to begin loading troops. By 2:20 a.m. on February 2, they had taken aboard 4,935 soldiers and departed for Bougainville. The scene stunned many crew members aboard the Japanese warships as the scale and urgency of the withdrawal became fully apparent. The men wore only remnants of clothing, so filthy and worn that their physical condition had deteriorated severely. According to one officer's report, they might have been happy, though they never said so. Everyone was suffering from malaria or dengue, and the constant diarrhea left them so weak they often fell asleep. The reason the place was nicknamed Starvation Island was painfully clear. They could only be fed porridge because their digestive systems were too badly damaged for anything else. Despite one of the destroyers being lost after hitting a mine or a PT boat torpedo, the first evacuation went smoothly. Thousands of soldiers still remained. On February 4 at 11:30 p.m., a second evacuation mission left the Shortland Islands, this time with 20 destroyers in Admiral Hashimoto's unit, plus 2 replacements. Once again, the Allied forces on Guadalcanal were alerted by coast watchers, and American planes from the Cactus Air Force tried to intervene. In the fighting, 1 American plane was lost and 3 were damaged in exchange for 11 attackers shot down by Japanese Zero fighters. Hashimoto had to shift his flag after his flagship was sunk a second time. He moved to the destroyer Kawak. The Japanese destroyers met minimal resistance from American PT boats as they approached Guadalcanal. The operation ran smoothly, and in just 2 hours, 3,921 troops were loaded. General Hyakutake and his staff were among those evacuated. The journey back to Banaka went as smoothly as the loading, and by February 5, Hyakutake and the rest of the unit had arrived safely. The operation remained secret. American commanders still believed Japanese forces were being reinforced. General Patch thought that 2 recent Tokyo Express missions had delivered a full regiment with equipment. As a result, he ordered a cautious advance, thinking the Japanese were preparing a trap. On February 7, the 161st Regiment was still 9 miles from Cape Esperance. Had Patch known the Japanese were evacuating, he likely would have ordered a full assault. Meanwhile, Hashimoto was preparing for the 3rd and final evacuation. Though the previous run had been uneventful, he decided to take a southern route around the Solomons to avoid alerting American bombers. Despite this, 36 American aircraft attempted an attack, but were repelled by Japanese fighters. 1 destroyer was damaged and guided to safety by another ship. The remaining 16 destroyers arrived and began loading the last troops. The process was quick and completed just after midnight on February 8. A total of 1,972 troops were taken aboard. Many had to be physically lifted onto the ships. Too weak to climb rope ladders, sailors searched for any stragglers before departing. Around 1:30 a.m., Hashimoto ordered the group to head directly back to Banaka at top speed. After an uneventful 8.5-hour journey, all destroyers returned safely. Colonel Matsuda, who oversaw the rear guard, reported to General Hyakutake that Operation K was complete. A total of 10,828 soldiers had been evacuated, exceeding Tokyo's expectations. Though relieved, Japanese commanders were also realistic. Many of the evacuated men would never recover enough to serve again. Their time on Guadalcanal had left them broken in body and mind. As Hashimoto completed his final departure, American forces advanced cautiously toward Cape Esperance. The Japanese rear guard had already left, leaving behind only those too ill or weak to resist. Upon assessing the situation, American commanders confirmed that the Japanese had abandoned the island. On February 9, units of the 161st Regiment linked up near Tenaru, confirming the evacuation. General Patch reported to Admiral William Halsey that the Japanese were no longer present and that the Tokyo Express was no longer operational in the area. Even the Americans had to respect the skill with which the Japanese had withdrawn under their noses. Admiral Chester Nimitz remarked that up until the end, it seemed the Japanese were reinforcing, not retreating. Their plan had remained hidden until it was complete. Because of this misinterpretation, neither Patch nor Halsey was blamed for the failure to prevent the evacuation. They had acted on the best information available. After 6 grueling months, the Americans had won. The New York Times on February 10 declared that every American heart thrilled at the news of victory on Guadalcanal. The nation celebrated rather than criticized. In contrast, Japan struggled to spin the defeat. The public was told the mission was complete and that the troops had shown great courage. But military leaders knew it was a disaster. They tried to salvage some pride by highlighting their naval performance and the successful evacuation. Hashimoto was commended for his leadership. However, the damage to Japan's military strength was permanent. Ships and soldiers lost at Guadalcanal could not be replaced. According to author Richard B. Frank, a Japanese Navy officer once said that while many battles were remembered, only Midway and Guadalcanal were still talked about after